Okay, good evening. Welcome again. And this is going to be part 2 of the sin of Cain. And the title, of course, of this class is Accepting Responsibility, the importance of accepting responsibility. So last class, we discussed about some aspects of the sin of Cain, what caused it, what we can learn from it. And again, I go back to that very same point. Why do we know about it? Or better yet, the fact that we know about it, the fact that the Bible shares it with us, the fact that it finds it necessary to tell us a story and certain specific details of it tells us that that's what we need to focus on. That's what we need to take a lesson from and say, what do we garnish from this? What do we take from this in order to know how to live our lives better? What God expects from us. So when God comes to Cain, if you have the story in your mind, I'll just give you quickly the narrative. When God comes to him, God says to him, what did you do? What did you do? And he says, I hear the sound of the blood, or actually he says blood in plural, of your brother crying out to me from the ground. So why does God ask him what he did? The fact is, God absolutely knew what he did. God wasn't just strolling down the street and he said, Cain, hey, what happened? What's up? No, he knew exactly why he was there. Cain is the Hebrew for the Hebrew for Cain. Cain knows exactly what he did. He knows why God is there. He's trying to play a game in which, if you look in the verses, he doesn't respond. He doesn't say what he did. He doesn't admit really to anything. He kind of, I guess, gives up no contest, so to speak. It's almost like a no contest because he doesn't say, I didn't do it. He doesn't even say a defense of, I didn't mean to do it. It was by mistake. No, he just remains silent, which in a sense is an admission, okay? Because he really couldn't contest it. There was nothing, no argument that he can put up. But the real question is, we need to focus in on, why did God ask him, what did you do? And then God proceeds in telling him what he did. Obviously, if the blood's crying out to me, that means someone spilled that blood. You're the culprit. So why does God find it necessary to ask him what he did? And after that, what happens? God tells him what his punishment's going to be. And he says to him, you're going to be cursed. You're going to be cursed from the earth that was used. I wouldn't say volunteered. They didn't volunteer. They didn't have a choice. But you're going to be cursed from this earth that swallowed up the remains of your brother, that covered it up. And had I not been God, I'm just putting in my own words now, then no one would have ever known. The evidence was buried. They didn't have forensics in those days like they have today. What is this telling us? This is about step 1 in what I would call redemption. When a person sins, when a person does something wrong, when a person makes a mistake, what God is telling us is, he's asking us, what did you do? I want to hear it. I want you to say what you want. I want you to verbalize, not just in your mind. Tell yourself, oh, this is what I did. This is kind of, yeah, I know what happened because you were there. You were present. You actually perpetrated that crime, that act, that terrible act. It's not enough that it's in your mind. It's not enough that you know. You have to verbalize it. You have to say it. You have to bring it out, so to speak, into the atmosphere. Why? Let's take, for example, someone comes to the doctor. Why do they come to the doctor? To say hello, to have a cup of coffee. Why do you make an appointment by the doctor? Because you're ill. You know something's wrong. You're feeling nauseous. You're feeling pain. You're feeling uneasy. Some part of your body feels like you can't move it. You know something is wrong. Something is not right. What do you need to do now? What needs to be done? In other words, what is the process of healing? How can you go about having any chance at rectifying this problem? you have to find out what it is. You have to diagnose the problem. You have to pinpoint the problem. Before you do that, or in the absence of that, there is no healing. Because imagine somebody has a footache and you give them the top of the line cream, but it's not the issue. They have an internal infection. So what's the cream going to help? Or you're giving them an antifungal. What's that going to help if they have bacteria? So you need to determine, you need to be able to actually say, now saying in the case of a doctor can be writing it down, but you need to be able to point to it and say, this is it. This is what the problem is. Let's take another example. And it's effective because it works. I'm sure you've seen it in movies. But anybody who's been to any Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, whatever it may be, what usually happens in that circle? Person gets up and identifies themselves. And then what do they say? My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. Why? Why is that part of the system? Why do they need to say it again and again? Every time they get up, say I'm an alcoholic. Why do they need to say it at all? Embarrass themselves? Shame themselves? Make the people around them uneasy? Well, that is a setting in which people are hopefully destined, or set up at least, to have a good chance at healing, at fixing the problem to the best extent that a human being can. Sometimes the problem doesn't totally go away. In the case of an addict, it may remain with them for the rest of their life, but to be able to learn how to deal with it and how to curb it and how to, put it in a place where it's not going to come out always to roost and to create, havoc and problems in the person's life. So the person needs to identify it. The person needs to say, this is it. If you kind of skirt around it, even though you know it in your mind, if it's not identified, if you're not wearing it like a label or a verbal label, then you haven't even scratched the surface at the beginning of healing, at the process of rectifying the problem. Why is that? You see, our minds are very powerful. Our minds, we know the truth. I think 99% of the time when we do something, when something's not right, we know up here, but it's hidden. And it's hidden in a place that is susceptible for manipulation. Our minds can manipulate it. When you have something in your mind, you know you did something, but since it's you, it's not been broadcasted. You haven't said it in a way that's, like I said, out in the atmosphere, even if there's no one present in the room, but you haven't said it, you haven't spoken it, you haven't communicated it. It's not out there in the environment. It's all in here. And when it's all in here, there's a process that goes on in the brain. The brain manipulates things. And you can even, in some way, in some degree, even if the most horrific act that you did, the most disgusting, vile thing that a person did, but in their brain, they can always find some measure, some form of justification. And if it's not a justification that says, no, it was a good thing, but it's enough justification to allow one to be manipulated into not facing the truth and therefore not being able to move forward and starting the process of getting rid of that sin, getting rid of that, spiritual, emotional, psychological bacteria and moving forward to become a better person. Because the brain can even tell you, well, it's a bad thing, but the circumstances, it's not really your fault. Whatever that manipulation may be, if it's in here, it's distorted. It's not the real truth. Even though you know the truth, but it's quickly being sugar-coated in so many different ways, intellectually and even emotionally. The brain and the heart start to work in collusion and start to so to speak, process and fabricate some kind of, illusion that this is not so terrible, or it's not you that's terrible. It's the act that's terrible, but it's not you, and so on. But when you verbalize and it comes out in so many words, clear words that have no ambiguity, this is it. I did that. I hurt that person, or I did this act. Now I am dealing with a certain reality. Now I have the truth. And that, being connected to the truth, becomes already a big measure, a big step towards the, what's it called again? Towards the process of what we call teshuvah, which is repentance, which is returning, which is becoming, going back to the person that you should be. And I want to take a moment. Think of it also from this angle. What is really the reason that if it remains in your brain processes it in such a manner that starts to manipulate it and starts to sugarcoat it and starts to distort the truth? What is that agent that works in the brain? In other words, the brain has so many abilities, so many capabilities. Why is this capacity of the brain being triggered? In other words, what is that trigger? What is that mechanism that's actually triggering that part of the brain? And that's why I say it's so dangerous to keep it in the brain, and you need to verbalize it. That's what God was saying to him. Tell me what you did. It's not enough that I know what you did, and you know that I know, and you know what you did. I want to hear it. I want you to admit it. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, going back to last week's class, where the origin of all sin, and specifically this sin, is extreme ego, it takes a lot of self-humiliation. It takes a lot of breaking and crushing of the ego to be able to verbalize those words and say, this is what I did. And this is what I did. Obviously doesn't make me look good. Obviously doesn't make me feel good in the eyes of people. That already is the beginning. It's the process. That begins to break that ego. If you take a big giant chunk of ice, even if you put fire to it, you don't expect to have a whole pool of liquid in a second. Not in a minute, not in two. It's going to take time. But you know that process has begun when you see that the ice starts to sweat. You see some condensation. Oh, it's working. The fire is now, that warmth is now visually showing its signs that it's actually going to be able to affect the melting of this ice. Likewise here, that ego is that terrible chunk of ice that makes us all into ourselves and does not allow us to feel and to sense what the rest of the world is feeling and sensing, and how negatively it can affect others and so on. And we become just frozen in ourselves. This admission of truth is like fire, begins to melt away. It cracks at that ice. It's not a full and absolute solution, but it's the first step. It's the beginning. You need to have this, otherwise you don't have anything. Now, take it a step further. What happens when you admit it? What are you essentially doing? You're admitting the truth. You're admitting the truth. And you say, yes, this is what I did. No manipulation. Because remember, when it's in your brain, back to what I said before, you know the truth, but it's automatically and inherently being manipulated. So it's not the full and absolute truth. It's not the absolute truth. It's not the clear, perfect truth. But when you say it, those words mean exactly what they mean to anyone and everyone that hears it, or that potentially would hear it. So that is the truth. You've now connected with the truth. So even somebody who committed the worst sin, the worst crime, just connected with the truth. What happened when they connected with the truth? What is the truth synonymous with? Who is the truth? Who is the ultimate truth? God. In fact, in much of the Hebrew literature, even in some of the prayers, we refer to God as Hashem Emet, or Hashem Elohim Emet. God, whatever the various expressive names of God, but we say God is truth. The ultimate truth is God. So when you admit the truth, you've now connected to something, to godliness. Now, what is the value in connecting to godliness? What is the true effect of this? Let's think about it. I did something wrong. I hurt someone. I hurt something. I hurt the world, right? Even if I did something, a sin, I committed a sin, I did something I shouldn't have done, even if I didn't directly affect someone, I didn't steal from anyone, I didn't hurt, I didn't punch, or God forbid, injure anyone, I didn't kill anyone, but I still essentially took something away from the world. In other words, I created a negativity in the world. How do I reverse that? I'm just a mortal being. How do we have the process reversing? In other words, the real question is, why bother going through the process of repentance, of transformation, of remorse? What difference is it going to make? What's done is done. Correct? And perhaps it could be. There's certain things we do. We cannot undo the physical effect of what I did. I can't. I'll never be able to do that. So that what value is it to even bother, to even attempt to go through a process of healing, go through a process of remorse, transformation? I can only worry about the future. I can't worry about the past. Well, the answer is, why is it that we cannot change the past? Why is it that we cannot transform that which was already done, that which was already committed? You committed an act, it's done. Said a word, it's no longer in your control. The reason for it is because we're finite beings. And we're not the ultimate true beings. In other words, because today we're here, tomorrow we're not. What is essentially the hallmark of truth? That it transcends any whatsoever obstacle, any whatsoever limitation. It is infinite. If you think about it, the inherent quality of truth is that it's infinite. Truth is something which never changes. People may not like it at a certain time. People may try to distort it. People may try to throw mud at it. But the truth is the truth. You know, the famous expression that a liar needs to have a good memory, because you have to constantly remember what you said and how you said and keep on coming up with stories, and it should all be consistent. That's usually how they break a suspect when they do interrogations, considering that the interrogators, that the detectives, whoever it is, investigators, have the patience, and usually they do. And you go on, and when the story starts to change, it could only be for one reason. Why? Because it's not the truth. So now let's hear the truth. And finally, at a certain point, people break. Why? Because you're confronted with the truth. You can't argue with it. Because the truth, no matter what you try to do to it, no matter how one will try to manipulate it, the truth transcends anything and everything. Why? Because the truth is inherently connected to God, and therefore it's infinite. So no finite action, no finite agent can stem it, can stop it. There's no way. So what happens now when a person admits the truth? What happens when they say, yes, this is what I did? Yes. They have now made some contact, some direct connection with God. God is infinite. God, once you connect it to God who's infinite, you now have, at least spiritually, maybe even better yet, even psychologically, if you do a good job, and emotionally, you have now the ability, you have the power of the infinite to be able to change even that which is in the past, which typically a human being has no control over. It's gone, it's past, it's behind you. So it's almost, in a certain sense, like you're able now to literally reach into the past. It's not a physical space, and almost change that. At the same time that you may not be able to change the actual physical results of your action, because that is in the finite realm, that's not going to change. But as far as your soul is concerned, as far as your being is concerned, as far as you, the person who perpetrated this terrible thing and are carrying around that, let's call it that filth of that sin, of that terrible crime, of that action, you are able to do so because you've now connected to the truth. And God didn't come there to like stick it to him and point at him and say, hey, look what you did. He was doing him a favor. God is all compassionate. God is trying to help him. This is one of the first terrible sins that were perpetrated, and one of the worst ones. Or perhaps, like in the words of the Maimonides, this is the worst, because you can never come back from it. You took the life. You can never bring that life back. And yet what God is telling him is, even though you'll never be able to bring his life back, That you cannot do. But you can bring your life back. You essentially have killed yourself. You've hurt your own soul. A soul is a living thing. You've killed yourself by doing that. Connecting to the truth will give you that power, at least the ignition, to be able to start to touch the infinite, to reach into it, and to use that power to be able to hopefully move forward and transform. So admitting the truth is very, very important. And the truth is, if you learn this now, a lot of things make sense. Because inherently, I just want to put this as just as a side note, we do find this even in the law of our country. Almost always when you read about a crime, you read about a proceedings in court, or whatever, and usually it's always there's an expectation at some point, or there's a hope at some point that the culprit, the criminal, accepts responsibility. And many times when they do and they ask for forgiveness, that actually even helps to sometimes lighten their sentence, their punishment. And if you ask yourself why, it doesn't make sense. Is it because you were suddenly a nice guy and you admitted it? But there is something to it. And I'm pointing out even people who are not, so to speak, following life biblically, but the law that we follow here in this country is basically more or less rooted in the principles, in the ideals of the Torah, of the Bible. And now you can see in a sense where it comes from. If a person can admit it, if a person can at least face the truth, there is some redemption in that. If you still are determined and stubborn to not admit the truth, that you're not facing the reality. You're not there. So what is there? Only the action that you perpetrated. Only the crime, the terrible effect of it. And the terrible effect of it, not only on the person or the people that were hurt by it and society, but you yourself. You're dead. There's no ounce of life. The moment you connect the truth, there's a little ounce of life. There's a little glimmer, right? Somebody passes out, you check for a pulse. If there's a little, there's hope. There's something to go on. Once somebody has been pronounced dead, there's no paramedic that's going to run in an hour later and say, you know what, let me try. Let me give it a shot and start administering CPR. What for? You're just actually hurting a dead corpse. There's nothing that you're going to do. It's dead. There's no life, not even a glimpse, not even a little, shimmer of life in there. There's no point. So to summarize, God was trying to get him to admit. Well, you remember I mentioned, notice in the verses, he doesn't accept any whatsoever responsibility. He doesn't. And that's where the verse continues. And God says to him, and now you shall be cursed from the earth that opened up its mouth to swallow your brother's remains. Now, the word in Hebrew from can mean literally from. You're going to be cursed from the earth, which, by the way, literally means, as the Talmudical sages explain, that what God was saying to him is the earth has already been cursed once. By the original sin, I already cursed the earth, that it would give out its produce in a very difficult manner. Man won't have it easy as it was right in the beginning. And now it's going to be cursed even more. So you're going to be cursed and the earth is going to be cursed. That's the literal meaning. But on a deeper level, the Hebrew word from can also mean in English than. You're going to be more cursed than the earth that is cursed. You're going to have a greater curse than the earth that was cursed. What does that mean? Since you did not accept responsibility, since you did not admit the truth, you didn't have that courage to help break your ego. I was giving you that chance. Yes, the earth became an accomplice, albeit it wasn't by choice, but it was an accomplice. It became an accessory to your crime. And therefore the earth has to be cursed at some level because it's involved in this curse. But you who refused to take any whatsoever responsibility, you're going to be cursed even more than the earth. You're going to be cursed to such a degree that it would be noticeable that it's more than the earth. Why? Because you didn't accept responsibility. You did not accept any part of this. And therefore, God, like God's, so to speak, saying, you're not helping me. You didn't give me that opportunity to help you try to overcome this with a lesser, so to speak, with a lesser punishment. I'll be the punishment, and I'll explain that in a moment, why it's necessary. But now you're not giving me that ability. So I want you to think of it this way. Think of it. Today, thank God with technology, we have various types of fabrics. Conventional fabric, something spills on it, something that creates stains, it becomes very hard to remove. It goes into the fabric is absorbent, it's porous. And now you need to use sometimes, if you want to get rid of it, you're determined to do so, you need to use some very harsh chemicals and rubbing. And with that, it's going to hurt the fabric. You know, especially if sometimes you don't see it, it's not noticeable with the naked eye. But if you look closely with a microscope or with a magnifying glass, after treating it with harsh chemicals and rubbing it with a brush or what have you, you will notice that that fabric has now become compromised. That fabric has lost some of its luster. So some of it has gone lost. Why? Because you were determined to get rid of the stain. What is sin? Sin is essentially a stain, a blemish on the soul. You have fabrics that are designed in a manner that they repel liquids, that they repel stains and things like that. They do get dirty. They do. They still get dirty. I mean, you're determined to pour coffee and it's going to get dirty, but it's much easier to clean. Because, so to speak, in itself, it has the process which in itself cleans itself, or doesn't allow so much dirt to really seep in it and become permanent, as the case in a regular fabric that hasn't been, designed with that same technology. And in this case, that's what God said to him. I gave you that opportunity. Had you broken your ego from within, had you connected to the truth, had you admitted what you did, you would have done almost like a semi-self-cleansing. So then the punishment, which the purpose of punishment is not God getting back and you say, you did that, so I'm going to hurt you with this, and I'm going to show you who's boss. Really, essentially, the idea of punishment is to cleanse a person. To cleanse a person from that sin, just like you would take a garment and rub it, just like you would take a pot that has some food stuck to it and scour it with a strong abrasive thing with strong soap, because you want to clean it, you want to use it. I have a purpose for you, Cain. I want you to live life. Life for you doesn't stop here, even though spiritually you killed yourself, even though spiritually you've taken away your own life. I want you to live. You can't live with this filth. It's unhealthy, spiritually and emotionally. We need to clean it. But you didn't help me. You didn't help me in the process of cleansing. And therefore, I have no choice. You're going to be cursed, not just from, but more than the earth that is cursed. In other words, your punishment is going to be greater. And then what does he say to him? What is the punishment? You're going to be a wanderer. Na v'na tiyeh ba'aretz. You're going to be wandering here, there in the land. You're not going to have stability. Do you recall that? Mm-hmm. That was the punishment that he gave. Mm-hmm. That was the punishment he gave. What does that have to do with anything? Especially considering that the way God operates, as the sages term it, midah keneged midah, a measure for a measure. Think of it this way. You have a job, okay? Whether you're a doctor, whether you drive a garbage truck for a living, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a police officer, whether you're a carpenter, at the end of the day, what's your reward? What's your return? Money. Mm-hmm. It might be a check. It might be cash. It might be in your debit account. Money. Really, essentially, the reward is not directly correlated to what you did. And the same is also in a negative act. Mm-hmm. You go to prison, you can have a thief, a repeat offender, an armed robber, a rapist, a murderer, and then maybe even somebody that did terrible white collar crime, more or less receiving the same punishment. So the actual punishment, the price that they're paying, is not absolutely correlated and connected seamlessly with what they did. Make sense?
Yeah.
God doesn't operate that way. The act itself, the whether it's an act of a positive act or whether it's a negative act, the consequence, in other words, what it brings and it heals as a reaction to it from God, is always a measure for measure. There's a connection. So what is the connection between what he did and God telling him, you're going to be a wanderer? You're not going to have a stable place. You're going to have your place, so to speak, to put your head down and say, this is mine. The answer is, what is wandering? First of all, wandering is not living. If you think about it, even people who love to travel, even people who like to explore the world and everything, but they always have, either literally or at least in the back of their minds, they have a home base. Even if somebody takes and sells everything, gives up everything, but they always know they have a mom's house to go back to. They have somewhere that if anybody says, okay, send it to my sister and whatever, okay, one day when I go back, or she'll find a way to get a hold of me and say, or I have a mother, or I put it in storage, even if I don't rent a storage unit. But in the back of my mind, I always know there's a place I'm going to go back to. This is my place of origin. This is my homeland. Now I'm going to explore the world. A year, 2, 3, it doesn't matter. But at some point, think about it, even people who live in the jungle, they have their geographical territory. So they may not live like we live, right? But they still have a place. A human being has a place. I mean, for that matter, even animals have their, more or less, their geographical location, their comfort, where they are, what they are. To be a wanderer is to be void of life. That's number one. That was his first sin. But what was his second sin, essentially? As we said, not admitting the truth, not fessing up, not being able to face the reality. That really enhanced the sin. But if you think about it as a second stage in a sin, which actually may have been worse because that really brought about all the terrible consequences, that is also an act of wandering. When you say the truth, it's settled, it's clear. Especially considering what I said, you're now connected to God. But when you don't say the truth, in fact, there's a saying in the Talmud that says, quote, sheker means falsehood, ein lo raglayim, has no feet. So to speak, it has no foot to stand on. That's where the adage comes from. Now, what does that mean? Literally, if you look at the 3 Hebrew letters that make up the word sheker, they all have only a base, which is a one-pointed base. And thinking of a letter, if you thought of it as a physical thing, how long can you stand on one foot? How long can you stand? Shin, kuf, resh. How long can you stand on one foot? Only for that long. At a certain point, it has to collapse. And you see all falsehoods in the world go throughout history, from the beginning of mankind. At some point, no matter how long they lasted and how long they endured and how long people bought into it, at some point they started to crack, started to fall down, fall apart. The Hebrew word for truth, which is emet, aleph, mem, tav, but it has either 2 legs, so stability, or has a flat base. Remember, this is not just coincidental. And this is not arbitrary. Because remember, the Hebrew alphabet was designed by who? By God himself. So they have meaning not only in the sound of the letter, not only the numerical value as they are, the Hebrew letters have numerical value, but even the shape of the letter tell you something. So if the choice for the Hebrew word, which again, the Hebrew word for truth is not our choice. It's not like people came together one day and decided, okay, we're going to call it this, we're going to call it that. It's divinely dictated because it's in the Bible. The word emet, which means truth, appears in the Bible. God dictated those words to Moses. So if that's the word, it has a base. It's stable. When you connect it to that, when you have a home, remember, even if you lost your key, it's still your home. It's still your base. Your stuff is still in there. And that's your place of comfort that you look forward to, that you're yearning for. So you know it's just a matter of how do I get in there? How do I get back home? But it's yours. It might be distant, but it's yours. But when it's falsehood, you're wobbly, you can't stand, you're wandering, that's what God told him. You didn't want to connect to the truth. You didn't want to accept responsibility. This is the consequence of that. And in fact, there's a saying in the Talmud which tells us about stability and tells us about having a home. And it literally says the following. It says, one who has no home is not a person. In other words, to be a complete person, to be a whole person, you need a home. Even if you're not sleeping there, even if you're not actually dwelling there, but you have a base. You have somewhere to go. You have something that's yours. Doesn't matter how big or small that home is. It's still a home. And that's what God was saying to him. And if you think about it, the truth, think in terms of stability, something that connects to what we said before. Practical example. Yeah, I said the truth. You don't need to be floating all over the place. You don't need to be exploring any lies, any excuses. It's true. It is. This is what it is. The moment one starts to lie, there's a certain sense of lack of stability because you're here, you're there. Because you have to start moving and start coming up with all the excuses and all the lies. And that is what God was telling him. It's a consequence of what you did. It's a consequence of what you said. Now we'll take it to the next step. What did Cain turn around to God and say? Oh boy, if this is what's going to happen to me, I'm going to wander all over the world. Now I'm scared. I'm scared of all the animals, right? They're going to attack me. What am I going to do? In other words, this is cruel and unjust punishment because I'm not just going to wander. That's bad enough. Now I'm going to be in danger. I'm going to be in constant danger of being attacked by all these wild animals. Why was he suddenly afraid of being attacked by wild animals? Why was he suddenly afraid of the animals? We know that God gave man that power. As he said to Adam, you will rule over the entire universe. You will rule over the animals. So why is he suddenly afraid? That's precisely the answer. When God says, he created us in the image of God, we literally have like an aura of godliness. You and I may not see it, but animals can sense it. And it's actually brought down that when a person doesn't behave like a human being should behave, when a person doesn't behave in that godly fashion, in that basic, fundamental, godly manner, in other words, you become totally dead. You're just a walking piece of meat. The animal doesn't respect it. Cain knew that very well. And now when it was made clear to him, and there was no denying it, he still didn't admit anything. And maybe it was a little too late. But what is he now? He realizes, I'm not connected to the truth. So I'm not connected to God. I didn't behave in a godly manner, just the opposite. Oh my gosh. And now I'm wandering. I don't even have my base. I can't even protect myself physically. Forget about spiritually. Where am I? I'm totally lost. If I'm a wanderer, which by definition means what? I'm not connected to the truth. I don't have the godly aura. Animals will not respect me. And literally it says it's one who has the fear of God. And we all know the story of Daniel, the prophet Daniel, when he was thrown into the lion's den. You can look at it as a, wow, it was a miracle. But it's not listed typically in the miracles of like the splitting of the sea. Perhaps, think of it this way. This was a true godly man. A genuinely godly man. The animals can sense what we can't sense. And they saw him. They're not going to go bite God. They didn't know how to translate it. They don't have the words for it. But to them, their instinctive reaction was, this is something godly. This is something, we don't touch that. We don't eat that. God did him a favor. And you see God's kindness. Even though he behaved in this manner, even though he deserved measure for a measure what he was getting, to be cursed more than the ground is stable. And he's going to be cursed more than the ground, where he's going to be a wanderer. He's not going to be a normal living person anymore, because if you have no home, you aren't a person, as the Talmud says. But God was kind to him and said, okay, I'll give you some little sign. You'll have a little tiny pilot light on you. I don't know what it looked like. Something spiritual, which will repel the animals. Not that he deserved it, but God was kind, so he can endure his punishment. So that, I guess, sums up, those 3 steps: admitting, accepting responsibility, and that helps the process of getting through the cleansing, because we connect to the infinite. And if you don't do it, then you're connected to the untruth. You're a wanderer. So let's talk about it. Wow, that was